So today our panel is talking about the data economy. I have a great lineup here. I'm going to let them go through and introduce themselves. They're going to talk for about 5 to 7 minutes. I'm going to be taking some notes and asking some questions. And then at the end of that, we're going to open it up for the real secret sauce, which is the Q&A here, taking questions from the audience. And we're also going to be fielding some questions from people that are watching on the live stream as well. Why don't we start over here? Joel, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself, and then we'll just go on down the...
Sure. I'm Joel Gurin. I'm a senior advisor at the GovLab at NYU, former chair of the White House Task Force on Smart Disclosure, and author of the book Open Data Now.
I'm Fran Berman. I'm chair of the U.S. chair of the Research Data Alliance. I'm also a Hamilton Distinguished Professor at Rensselaer and also co-chair of the National Academy's Board on Research Data and Information.
I'm Paul Zolfaghari. I'm the president of MicroStrategy, which is a Tysons Corner, Virginia-based enterprise software company that concentrates on building tools and technologies to allow access to information and give companies and organizations an opportunity to mine and make better decisions with that information.
Great. Okay. Joe, why don't you start us off?
Sure. So let me use this time to talk a little bit about the work that we're now doing at the GovLab, which Nick graciously cited, and in particular the Open Data 500 and what we're learning, and also why we launched into that project. So the GovLab, which is founded and directed by Beth Novak, who was the former deputy CTO of the United States and directed President Obama's Open Government Initiative in his first term. We have launched the GovLab to look at ways to improve how we govern and how governance is done in ways that ultimately will improve the lives of citizens in the U.S. and around the world. And in doing this, we look at the uses of technology, the uses of collaborative technology, the uses of data, and in particular the use of open data to achieve those ends. So I kind of run the open data practice, which is a fairly new thing at the GovLab, and our first major project is the Open Data 500. So the Open Data 500 was launched, we set ourselves the challenge of seeing whether it would be possible to identify 500 companies based in the U.S., or at least with a major presence in the U.S., that were using government open data as a key business resource. People sometimes ask why we chose 500. It sort of sounds like the Fortune 500. It's a really big number, and we thought, what the heck, let's see if we can do it. So we launched into this, frankly, not knowing whether we would find 500 such companies. We did. The project is still a work in progress, and I would urge all of you to please check it out at opendata500.com. That's 500 the numeral, not spelled out. And give us any thoughts or feedback you have. And please catch me at the break, if you will. I'll be here till about noon, but I would love any input any of you have on companies that we might have missed or that you think we should look at in particular. What we're finding really tracks the kind of picture that Nick had laid out very, very well, and by looking at 500 companies, we're able to really do a deep dive and see where the economic value of open data is now showing itself. So we are finding companies all over the country. We're finding companies large and small, and we're finding them in all sectors of the economy. And I thought what I would do just to get the ball rolling is give you some examples of the kinds of applications we're finding. So the classic examples of government open data, at least at the federal level, are GPS and weather data. And I think there are now very well-known examples of the uses of both of those kinds of data sets. Garmin, using GPS data, now has a market cap of about $7 billion. In the weather arena, the Weather Channel sold for about $3.5 billion some years ago. We have certainly new companies like Weather Analytics, which is here today, and the Climate Corporation, which I agree is really a terrific example of government open data being put to use. I think a couple of things that are interesting about these particular examples. One is that it really is hard to predict how government open data will be used. So the initial decision to release GPS data as data that the public could use was made by President Reagan while the system was still being created. It was 10 years after that announcement that cell phones became kind of common accessories for everybody, and it was 10 more years before cell phones even really had any kind of primitive screen. So the fact that we now have apps like Uber or Foursquare or others that would not exist without GPS would not have been even remotely possible to predict when the data was released. But that's part of the argument, I think, for releasing open data is, as President Obama said, to help create products and services we can't even imagine yet. That is actually literally true for many of these applications. The Climate Corporation, I think, is a different kind of story. While they are a weather insurance company and certainly began very focused on insurance, they now probably know more about farming, weather, and climate than anyone else on the planet. And they've told me, I did an interview for my book with their CEO last spring. They believe they can increase profitability for farms by 20 to 30%. So it's like you start off selling insurance, you end up leading the green revolution or the next green revolution. And we're seeing those kinds of things again and again. The other thing about the Climate Corporation is it's important to stress that what they've done is based almost entirely on free government data. So in principle, anybody in this room, although it might take some effort, could get a hold of the same data sets. What they have brought in value is the analytic ability and really some incredible kind of analytic chops to figure out how to use this data in completely new ways. What this shows us, and by the way, they were just bought by the Monsanto Corporation for around $1 billion fairly recently. So what this shows, and the reason that I think we're going to see government open data power a lot more than just apps, is that it kind of turns the conventional business proposition for data on its head. I think our conventional thinking has been that data is valuable if you own the data and can do things with it because nobody else owns it. What we're seeing now are a number of companies that take data that nobody really owns because everybody has it, but they're bringing value in how they use it, and that value can add up to $1 billion or more. Just in the interest of time, I'm just going to check off about 4 or 5 other examples, and then we can do more in the Q&A. But other areas where we're seeing the emergence of major open data companies are in healthcare, where we have companies like Aiden that is using open data about post-hospital care to help discharge planners find the best possible care for their patients. iTriage, which uses a public registry of providers to help people find emergency services wherever they are in the country. Archimedes, which does very sophisticated predictive analytics based on health open data, and I think we'll hear more about that on that kind of work on a later panel today. In finance and investment, Analytics Insight is using SEC data to provide very sophisticated investor advice in an incredibly user-friendly form. CalcBench is using the latest data from the SEC in XBRL, extensible business reporting language. Somebody has developed a timing app with government open data.
That's the not so
that must be connected with the atomic clock somewhere in some government lab, and on and on. In energy, you have O-Power. In trade, you have Panjiva. In education, you have a number of new companies starting up. You can see all of these and more at opendata500.com, and I'll be happy to talk more at the Q&A.
It was
Thanks.
supposed to be a subtle shock that went into your seat there, but I must have missed
It made its point.
missaid
That's
it.
good.
That was the hook.
Thanks, Joel.
Sure.
Francine.
Okay. I want to talk today about research data, and I'm going to define research data really broadly as any data developed by anyone in an open access way that is used for research. And so I want to address 3 questions today. First of all, why should we care about research data? Second of all, why is the research data economy at risk? And third of all, what do we do about it? So, let's think about research data. If you think about it, we know that research data is certainly incredibly important for scientific discovery. Because of the data from the Large Hadron Collider, we know about the Higgs boson or the God particle. Because of the data from telescopes from around the world, we know about the existence of habitable new planets. Because of data from sensors, we know about how species and ecosystems work together, et cetera. Equally important is the importance of this data for societal challenges. This kind of research data has revolutionized health. We know more about how the human body functions. We know more about the characteristics of disease. We know a lot more about treatment. We know about cities and physical infrastructure. We have smarter cities, smarter data. We can respond to disasters better. We have a safer world. So this research data is really important to everyone, not just the research community. And it's really the engine by which we drive current and future innovation. So let's think about why the research data economy is at risk. And what that means is that research data must live somewhere, and somebody's got to pay the mortgage for all the different places that research data live. So it really boils down to the question of who pays the data bill. And the issue for us is that research data has a stakeholder problem. This is the bad news. So if you think about it, those who generate the data, those who benefit from the data, those who manage the data or host the data, and those who use the data, and those who pay for the data. All of those groups are very important groups of stakeholders. In the private sector, we don't have this problem as much. If you think about it, Google or Amazon or Facebook or Microsoft, all of these companies get competitive advantage by using your clicks, by using your online behavior to be able to understand how you function and how you use their products. It means that they can market to advertisers. It means they can produce better products. It means they can create competitive advantage. They take your data, they store your data, they use your data, and they pay their own data bills. So, the people who value the data in that scenario are the people who support the data and pay the mortgage for the data. So we're good to go. In the research environment, we don't have this situation nearly as much. The people who generate the data may be in the research community themselves. The people who use the data or that community are a broader set of the public. The people who manage the data may be a third party. And much of that data is generated through funding vehicles that are short term. You made a grant for several years. What happens to the data after that? And we have no way of kind of looking at that. What happens often is that the stakeholder groups are distinct. So those who manage the data, those who pay for the data, those who use the data, when they're distinct groups, it's hard to create that I value it and so I will pay for it. And what you often find is you get kind of a stakeholder version of hot potato. Everyone thinks that someone else will pay for that data. And in fact, if no one pays for it at all, we're at risk for loss or damage to that data. And in fact, we can experience a series of data blackouts because that data is just not available to us. So that's the bad news about the research data economy. And we need to do something about that if we care about innovation now and going forward. We want this data increasingly available to us. We want it available for now and for new innovation. So one of the things we have to do is sort of think about whose responsibility is that. And the responsibility is not within one sector. You're not going to get the private sector to do it all. You're not going to get the government to do it all. Academics won't do it all. And the community themselves will not pay for it all. So last August, Vince Cerf and I wrote an op-ed, and we published it in Science. For those of you fans of public access, the free version is available on my website, so you can read it. And what we talked about was a way to distribute the responsibility and the stewardship, the sustainability of research data for the community, valuable research data. We talked about options for the government. We talked about options for the private sector. We talked about options for universities, libraries, academics. And we talked about the ability of those of us who use this data to pay for it ourselves. It's absolutely critical for us to get going in an actionable way in all of these sectors to really think about who's going to host this data, Who's going to pay the mortgage for hosting this data? With that, it'll continue to be the very important engine that will drive innovation. Without it, we'll see a lot of increasing data blackouts.
Thank you, Francine.
Sure.
Paul?
Thank you. I guess we're as a private company, we have an interesting perspective on both the data economy, whether it be what we heard about from the deputy CTO and what the U.S. government is doing to make data available, and also what I've heard from a distinguished scientist to my right. One of the advantages we have by being a company that actually provides the tools and the solutions is that we work with both governments, local governments, federal governments, private companies, organizations that exist in this country and in other countries around the world. And what we see is an enormous opportunity for companies to improve the services that they provide and to provide greater value, whether it be to the citizens that they support or to their customers. And I think what we heard was about a lot of the new businesses that are sprouting up by taking advantage of some of these free and open data source and data opportunities that exist. And I think that's a very important thing for us to understand as a country, that we can continue to improve the competitiveness of the industries here by allowing them to benefit from and be at the leading edge of accessing that information and turning it into something actionable, and ideally something that improves our own economic standing. But I think the other part of this that we see is the imperative that exists in the ability to understand and manage data for existing companies to maintain their own competitiveness in the world marketplace. And what we see is the companies and the organizations that understand that data has now become not just an ancillary part of what they do, but virtually a core competency on how they produce and direct their service. And it's allowed them to go into a number of other areas, a number of other businesses, a number of other opportunities for them to monetize. And the ones that are behind in doing this, and we have an interesting observation of this as we get to come in and work with different companies, you see behind and falling behind at an ever-increasing rate. And I'm not sure, just to give a few examples of just simple examples of how information has literally improved companies in the United States and how they're using it, and others that don't are falling behind. We are fortunate and privileged to do business with General Motors, which, as you know, is the largest U.S. Manufacturer of automobiles. And for a number of years, they struggled with the reliability of their vehicles. I happen to own a General Motors car myself, and if you, over 10, 12 years, you've seen one of the biggest issues they've been trying to solve is the reliability of those vehicles. And there's lots of different ways to attack and improve the reliability and the quality of something that you produce, but one way is to have a atomic level understanding of how that vehicle is working and how people are experiencing it. And what we had the opportunity to do is to partner with General Motors and build a diagnostic database where they gather near real-time information about how their cars are performing via the OnStar system. If you own a car, you know that what you have now is you're driving around effectively in a mini computer, which is putting off on a by-second basis insight into how that car is performing. And if you contrast that to the previous era of how did organizations, how would a manufacturer actually get access to diagnostic data, it would be the one time a year that you brought your car in and had a mechanic look at it, which if it was an independent mechanic, nobody ever had that information. Nobody understood what broke. What happened was General Motors used the opportunity to say, in order to improve the reliability of their vehicles, they were going to concentrate on getting a very deep understanding of the performance and be able to use that to build better vehicles. And I think they would tell you, as we would tell you, that by becoming a data company, which you don't necessarily think of a company as General Motors as, but they have huge data assets. And by making that a core fundamental competency for them to understand, it has allowed them to help improve the reliability of those vehicles dramatically over the last 10 to 12 years. And so here you have a very heavy industry, heavy manufacturing. And I think a lot of times when we think about data and the data economy, we think about these great companies like a Google and a Yahoo or maybe even an Apple, and don't realize that actually in the traditional businesses that exist in this economy, the ones that have understood that their information is actually a valuable asset, can better improve the service that they provide. Our view, too, is as the government continues to open up and make more publicly available information available to private companies and to organizations, we work with companies to help bring that information also as an asset in support of private industries and private organizations. And so the more accessibility of the information, the more the entrepreneurial spirit of people who can understand what to do with that information, or the core missions of companies who are trying to provide a service or a product to the market can leverage that and build more competitive offerings. But again, with the perspective of a company that does direct operations in 28 countries around the world, our admonition really to the U.S. is to understand that everything that we can do to continue to foster not only the openness in our own data sets, but to continue to foster being at the leading edge of data scientists, the data scientist and research movement, to continue to support advanced degrees in understanding and engineering, that this is where the future of America's competitiveness lies. And if we don't take that with the sense of severity that we should, I think we'll find ourselves back behind other countries, other companies, who now realize that they have the ability, by managing data, to leapfrog the U.S., which has all the heavy assets and heavy industry and historical benefits that it has. But if you look at companies in our own economy that have leapfrogged others, they've done it by taking an innovative spirit to information. And I think the U.S. can't sit back and say that it has a position in a lot of these major industries, that it's going to continue to stay in leadership. Leadership in the next generation is going to be very closely tied to competitiveness around access to information, access to data. So I would suggest that nothing short of the future competitiveness of the country resides on us as an industry, an organization, a governmental entity, and academic institutions to understand that we need to ensure that we maintain the competitiveness here with our industries, with our students, with our organizations, so that we can stay at the forefront of the world's economy. And so we certainly, as a company that is privileged to work with many governmental organizations, we work very closely with CMS to provide insight and analytics about the performance and information around the delivery of healthcare, which obviously is going to continue to grow dramatically. We work with companies like the U.S. Postal Service to help deliver the mail on time. We work with companies like the Veterans Affairs Administration to ensure that our veterans are treated as best and as efficiently as possible. And we have the privilege also of working with many companies around the world doing the same thing. So our perspective is that the U.S. government, the U.S. industries, organizations, and academics should understand that panels like this and opportunities to bring together thoughts around data information, public and private partnership is an extremely important priority for us. And we see that and are thankful to have the opportunity to participate in that, and really would encourage everybody, I think, to support this at a macro level if given the opportunity to do so.
Thanks. Very interesting. Joe, not every company that is latching on to this open data is going to be sold for $1 billion. So I'm interested in when you were gathering this Data 500, do you have any sense of how long it takes for these companies to be profitable? Are the majority of them just eking out an existence? What's it like economically for most of these 500?
I think the economic success for these companies varies tremendously, but I do want to give a little bit of a caveat about how we're selecting them. So what we're looking at is companies that have either national or at least regional scale. And what we're finding, because a number of these companies use state or local data either in addition to or instead of federal data, we're finding that there are a number of companies that might begin in one city, but that over time are able to expand. So for example, there's a company called OpenGov. Oh, and by the way, many of these companies, there's a whole class of companies that make their business out of data management and taking government data and making it more useful. Companies like Enigma or Socrata or this one, OpenGov. OpenGov began by working with the city of Palo Alto to make its finances, budget, and other city information much more transparent, but they did it by developing a platform that they could then use for other cities as well. So they're now in about 20 cities, began in California, now they're in New Haven, they're spreading all over the country. So I think there are a number of companies that are starting small, almost using an individual city or a state almost as a pilot, and then if they fail, they fail, and if they're successful, they can kind of bootstrap and expand. And I think we're going to see that as a pretty common model because there is so much value in the state and local data. In terms of the really big plays, you can have big successes, you can have big failures like in any industry. I don't know if it's possible to generalize, but I would say that what we're seeing more than anything is that the open data sector, if you want to think of it that way, is beginning to operate like other kinds of sectors or other kinds of businesses, that it's becoming. There are patterns and there are established ways, beginning to be established ways of using open data for business that I think will make this whole area grow over time.
And are you seeing any one particular sector that this open data companies are gravitating towards, like using state and local information, or is it, you mentioned a couple of great ones about healthcare. What are most of these companies going towards?
I think largely the development so far has been tracking the availability of data. So Securities and Exchange Commission data that investors can use has been available for a long time. With improved analytics, it's now possible for companies to do much more with that kind of data than they could before, and also with the SEC adopting XBRL, extensible business reporting language, that's opened up some opportunities as well. Healthcare is a big area, both because of the availability of data and its importance to the economy and to the public. Energy, we're seeing a lot of activity, and I think increasingly we'll see activity in areas like education and others. Plus, this whole business of making data more useful, taking open government data and accelerating the process that the government's already going through by making it useful and available today is actually a major part of, it's a significant proportion of the companies we're seeing.
Great. Francine, you mentioned this, you mentioned stewardship of data. What are how are various disciplines approaching research data stewardship?
It's interesting to see what's happening both within different disciplines and different sectors. What you find for research data is in some disciplines, data really provides a competitive advantage. So if you want to promote data sharing and open access to that data, it's more difficult than others. In my own discipline, in computer science, it's typically very easy to find other people's data. People are willing to share their data. For most of us, it does not provide a competitive advantage. In the health sciences, it's very different. In particular laboratories, your data is your competitive advantage. It's the way you get your new grants. It's the way you keep a leg up on the friendly but serious competition between you and your colleagues, et cetera. So there's something about sort of the culture. Your mileage varies around the academic environment and around the research data environment for that. What you're seeing is some very, very interesting things happening as the federal government becomes more interested in how we manage our data, how we access our data. So for example, the NIH has policies that tell you if you're taking our money, you must deposit data in these databases that are publicly available. They have that for Alzheimer's research, they have that in the Protein Data Bank, they have that for autism and a number of other things. So those kinds of things are sort of changing the culture around data sharing and making them go farther. This gets to really sort of another issue, which is what can we do across sectors? And one of the things that the federal government can do is be very clear about which valued data it's willing to help support. Protein Data Bank's a good example of that. Panel study of income dynamics, a longitudinal study of, economics and other kinds of factors for, 70,000 individuals over, decades. Very important as we start thinking about social science. On the other hand, the federal government just can't host everything. And if we're really clear about what we're not hosting, we can start creating a market in the other sectors for hosting that data. It can be hosted at the universities, it can be hosted private sectors. We can even be thinking at some, fee for service. I can pay $1.99 for, Lady Gaga or tune on iTunes, or I can donate to Wikipedia. But somehow research data we assume should be free. Perhaps there might be low barrier of access ways to do it, or maybe I would go to the National Virtual Observatory and see some annoying telescope ad in the same way I go to my email and I might see annoying ads for other things. If that helps support it, it might be a good option. So we can experiment with all of those approaches.
Paul, it was fascinating to hear you talk about how the future of American competitiveness could be tied to how these companies are leveraging their data. And I'm interested in just the day-to-day business that you've been doing and with your companies and trying to secure new business and stuff. Have you seen any blowback from the NSA revelations? And I know that some companies now, some countries now are instituting, are trying to institute very strict cross-data policies. You can't store data outside the country and so forth. So how is any of that, the NSA blowback, impacting your business, impacting the use of big data?
I think what you have, I was fortunate enough a few weeks ago to be across our European operations. So I spent time in France, I spent time in the United Kingdom, and I spent time in Germany with some partnership symposias that we were doing in those countries talking about information and where people are going, particularly with mobile and mobile technologies. It's clear that in countries outside the United States there is a public concern, if you will, for the accessibility of data and information. We are in a slightly different situation, I would suggest, from companies like the Googles and the Yahoos of the world who actually maintain the data themselves in their own databases. What we do is provide technologies to companies like that. So we're actually a close partner of Yahoo, and we give them analytic tools and capabilities to help them understand their business. But I will say that we also as a company have our own cloud solution. So we make our analytics technology, we sell it to companies and organizations to install on premise, but we also host data and have the opportunity to host it on behalf of customers. So we provide them with an opportunity to do it either way. And clearly I would say that the European countries are concerned about data now that does not physically reside in their own jurisdiction. So it's going to be, there has already been a challenge, I would suggest, with the European rules, but going forward you'll see more of that. And so in Germany, for instance, I think what you'll see is a desire to have the data maintained, reside inside of Germany so that it is generally subject to the rules of Germany. Now, we're fortunate as a company because we have software, again, that we can host ourselves or provide to hosted providers. So the German companies that would want to stand up and run the data service, we would work with and be able to support it. So I don't think it's necessarily going to impact us generally. It may very well have an impact on those companies whose fundamental primary business is maintaining the data. Can I make an observation about something that just came up a moment ago? So I think as Francine speaks, I sit here and I have to tell you one of the observations that I see is I look at healthcare data and I look at the opportunity that we have to improve healthcare and healthcare information. Forget for a minute that we're a for-profit company, and just give you an observation. There's something to be said about the fact that as we sit here today, Home Depot, which is a customer of ours, could tell you the exact number of hammers that are being sold in Charlotte, like within 5 minutes of me stepping outside. I could tell you the answer to that question, and yet we have nowhere near the same insight of information around health records, and health information, so that somebody's sick, maybe one of my daughters who walks into a pediatrician's office here in Maryland, The physician there has no information and no insight about whether or not this person is dealing with what looks like a cold and in fact sends the person home, but in fact maybe it's not a cold. Maybe it's a strain of some particularly deadly virus that, because we didn't actually aggregate information from other providers and provide that insight back to that general practitioner, they don't know that. And so I think there's something about what we can do with these analytic tools and technologies that exist to seriously focus on providing and improving health care delivery in this country and other countries. And absolutely there will be challenges around security and privacy and all, and I understand all of that, and we should, but there is an enormous opportunity to truly improve the health and the health standards in this country. And corollary benefit is bring down the cost of health care as people are more efficient in the delivery of healthcare. So I would just comment that I think it's wonderful what's being done to ask ourselves these tough questions. I think Francine has said a very, very and practical insight to all of this, which is who owns the data, who manages it, who supports it. But I would suggest that's a very important question that the country needs to come to grips with and come to an answer with, because every day that we don't provide analytic insight that tools like my company can provide directly on health information is a day that people are under what I would suggest suboptimal health treatment and increased health care costs. So it's an important thing. There are absolutely no doubt, as I said, there are privacy issues and security issues, and the country and the individuals would need to deal with that. But there is a real opportunity to improve health care delivery with technologies that are out there, and I think it'd be great to see the country take that on as an important challenge going forward.
Yeah, just to follow up on what you're saying, this is a fantastic and very interesting time to have that conversation. And one of the things that concerns me is we're not having enough of that conversation around stewardship and the economic support of that. With very interesting and important open access,
Right.
Memos from the White House, with the data management plans from the requests from the various agencies. We're seeing all kinds of interest in getting the data out there, using the data in interesting ways. But the data won't be out there if it doesn't live somewhere, and it won't live somewhere if nobody pays the bill. I was asked to head up a workshop at the NIH looking at the issue of a data catalog.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need a whole earth catalog for data? Do we need a search engine? Very interesting set of questions. But you can search for data, but if it, at the end of the day, if it doesn't live anywhere, it's irrelevant. And I think we have to have that conversation. The conversation of who pays for data is a difficult conversation because finances are lean for everyone. But if we don't have that conversation, if we don't get serious about having many options, I think we're really going to fall behind and we're going to be at risk.
I just very quickly to respond to that, say we not only see, it's an absolutely imperative to answer, but we see it being answered every day in the private industry.
Yeah.
I mean, we work with one of the world's biggest stock exchanges, and they provide analytics on stock data and information and provide it back both to the general public and to their customers. And it's clear who pays for it, the people who are using the data,
Yeah.
the people that are transacting. And yet in return, they receive a substantially improved service and better information. And I would suggest that the same could occur in the healthcare industry, via the people that are already paying for it, because at the end of the day, they're the beneficiaries of it through improved access and lower cost overall.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Here you go.
Mike Kruger, Department of Commerce. So we sit on about 20,000 data sets. We want to hopefully expand that considerably more. We go out and talk to businesses and say, well, what do you want? They say, what do you got? So we're looking at a weird chicken and egg thing. I could pick a few data sets to champion, but I have the biggest clue. And this goes from weather all the way through to like scientific research and this. So could the panel talk about what is the best way in which the government, who sits on all this assets, like Nick mentioned, can let companies know stuff's available and how to access it, some of that process, because we collect data really well. We sell it really poorly, and we'd like to market it, maybe not sell, but we'd like to market it a little bit better. Can you give some insight on that?
Well, I'll start. One of the things that we're doing with the Open Data 500, which I think may turn out to be the most significant piece, is that we're asking all of these companies to give us some very detailed feedback about the government data sets that they're using and those they would like to use. So we're saying, you know, what are you using? How valuable is it to you? What would make it more valuable? Are there data sets that you wish you could access, etc.? So we're going to have a live sample of about 500 companies telling us, and we will then be happy to share with you exactly how they feel it's working now and what would make it work better. And I would suggest, I'm hoping that that's going to turn out to be a way that we can really help facilitate some dialogue between these private sector companies and the data providers in government, because I think both sides would really like to have that kind of conversation. And I think starting from companies that are already doing the applications of government data is a very good way to begin to open up the new possibilities that are not being tapped yet. You can sort of build on that, I think, and build on that experience. So more to come, but hopefully in 2 to 3 months when we've completed the study, we will be very eager to see if we can get those conversations going.
I'll just say one thing about that. I think NIST is doing some really interesting things in that space and has been doing some interesting things with data, and it's exciting to see NIST contemplating doing more of it. One issue I think that's really interesting and important for us all is, you know, how do you decide what data is valuable? You know, how do you decide what you're going to be looking at in the future? And you know, in some sense, the private sector is doing some interesting things around it. You know, to coin a term, you have the kind of Yelpification of, you know, value. You know, how do you, you know, capture how many people are interested and who it's interesting to, and, you know, in what ways. As IDC pointed out in their studies, you know, many years ago, we don't even have the storage to keep all the data we're generating. You know, we passed that crossroads in about 2007. So, you know, we really have to make decisions about what to keep. Now, with respect to research data, you know, one interesting way to go about this is to sort of instrument the system. You know, figure out who's using which data and who it's valuable to, you know, which communities need which kinds of data. And then from the government perspective, to think about providing government stewardship to the data that ends up being the most valuable for some reasonable definition for value, and to create a pathway there. I think we haven't gotten very clear on what that is. And I think as we do that, that will really help us, you know, deal with some of the most valuable data, start looking at what that pathway is, and then create markets around dealing with the rest of the data that's of value, perhaps not to everyone or big, you know, groups of everyone, but, you know, very important subgroups of that.
Back here.
Alex Howard here.
Hey, Alex.
So, Mike, commerce does have a way to judge value. Who's paying for it? Freedom of Information Act requests come primarily from the private sector. So governments all around the country are making money from data they could be releasing. This strikes me as a real challenge. How do you justify the local and state government that has revenue associated with selling government data that it should instead release it to the public? I would say also with respect to storage, I can get a terabyte hard drive for under $100 now.
You can?
Right. Yeah, anybody can if they
Yep.
go to Amazon's. I'm not sure the cost of storage is so much of a challenge anymore. I mean, that's just gone through the basement. But this question of selling data and the Freedom of Information Act being a signal for demand for value, how do you justify this to governments that may see their national assets as something to be sold to technology companies? I've been to Moldova, and they asked me this question: you know, why shouldn't we sell our data to Google instead of opening it up for innovation?
Well, this is where you get to the hot potato. You know, maybe I shouldn't pay for it, maybe you shouldn't pay for it, but somebody's got to pay for it. So how do we distribute the costs of infrastructure, stewardship of the data, preservation of the data, access to the data in some sort of reasonable way? And, you know, I think there's a lot of different answers for a lot of different cases. I don't think you have a one-size-fits-all answer for that. Some government data should be free to the public. Some other government data perhaps has a low barrier to cost. Others, perhaps there's a high barrier to cost. But I think you don't get one answer for all of that. And yes, storage is going down. But I was talking about, you know, capacity. So we don't have as much total volume of storage as we need to host the total volume of data being generated. That's what I was saying.
Over here.
Stand so I can be heard. Professor Berman, thank you very much. My name is Bernadette Highland from 3 Round Stones. I think you hit the nail right on the head, and some of the discussions about open data being good, I feel as though we could have heard these same talks 3 years ago, and that we really need to get to the meat of exactly what you're saying. So I have a concrete proposal, since I see Nathan still in the room. Whatever governments can do to, or agencies specifically, to bring together stakeholders, either online or in person in small workshops. I've gone to events that have been held on federal holidays in the Reagan building that were sponsored by the German government of environment and nuclear regulatory stuff, like the German equivalent of the EPA and the NRC. And U.S. government employees were there, about 60 people, to learn about this. There's a tremendous desire for people within agencies to learn about it. They're even willing to do it on their personal time, about how to package up their data, how to reference it, how to make it self-describing, in whatever choice of formats they can make it available to people to use. Then there are lots of entrepreneurs. Then there are bigger companies like MicroStrategy who want to use it, or Walter's Tour and the big publishers, etc. But it should be ground up, grassroots, segment-specific healthcare, agriculture, EPA, etc. And stop telling us, oh, the government is good. All these people here know that. That's why we're here. We want to do something about it. We want to help people in government liberate the data. They can't do it by themselves.
Can I respond to that too, and just say from the private sector's perspective? The other thing too that you see is that companies like mine, if given the opportunity to partner with or have these forums to discuss with private or with public companies, are not just going to talk about the data as an abstract concept, but would literally be able to explain to people what they could see and do with the data if we're brought in as part of the conversation. We do this all the time. We are routinely asked to come meet with large companies and explain to them, what are people doing? How do we use? They don't presume to know the answers to everything. They know they have information. They assume there's value to it. They seek out companies like ours and give us an opportunity to come in and meet with them, meet with their executives and say, look, given what you have access to, here's the kinds of things that you can do. And so private companies do this on a very routinized basis, and there's just, in my opinion, there'd be no reason why a company like us, along with whatever the working group is, couldn't sit down within an organization like the Department of Commerce, and we wouldn't presume what the public should see, but we could certainly tell you what they could see and help people visualize and understand what information is readily available or could be made readily available, and then others can determine, politicians and policymakers, about whether they should move forward and make that information available. We are an enabler, if you will, to understand the art of the possible when it comes to information that people reside, and that is a conversation we are in on a daily basis with companies, and almost on a very infrequent basis with government and governmental entities.
Here.
So I'm actually working in a number of efforts across different levels of government, and what I've realized from working to these different levels is that government data, or much of it, is not only opaque to the general public, but it's also opaque to the people within their own agencies. Like, the transparency is not there, and when the daylight hits these data sets, it's very heterogeneous. So one of the difficulties in releasing these data to the public is getting the ducks in a row, so to speak, within the agency. So I think a lot of what we're talking about here is like partnerships in general, but like public-private partnerships, for example. What could you give us some examples, some models of these ideal, well, in your mind, what you've seen from your experience, ideal or model public-private or other types of partnerships that are lowering these barriers into these data, right? So what examples do you have where these government agencies, for example, are facing these kinds of transparency issues within their own bureau, or between sort of like, maybe it's an old guard kind of like, maybe it's NOAA and they used to have this relationship where this company downloads their data on bulk and then they create their own services around them, making their own services available to a broader audiences, lowering those barriers so that more people can participate like that, so that these relationships can scale, because I think that's what we're talking about here, is scaling these relationships so more people can gain access to these data sets. So do you have some examples that you could toss out for us and talk about how those transitions happen? What's the first step that agencies, for example, can take in making these data more accessible?
Yeah, it's a really excellent question, and I think the fact that I'm not having a lot of examples leap to mind means that it doesn't happen as often as it should. Either that or I'm forgetful, which is also very possible. But I can give you a couple of very quick thoughts. I mean, one is that I think some of the most successful public-private partnerships we've seen have been done in a kind of public service context more than a commercial context. So Google, for example, has now made the U.S. patent records available going back hundreds of years as a public service. That's fantastic, but I think that's really more part of Google's kind of, do good sort of arm than it is core to their business. I think in general, it's pretty fair to say that by and large, companies have seen what agencies have put out, whether it's health or finance or other kinds of data, and tried to work with it rather than developing sort of intentional collaborations from the beginning. However, my sense from talking to people on both sides is that there's a lot of openness to having those conversations, and I think they can be very productive.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I'll give you 3 examples that I think were public-private partnership, and they're all different, have worked. The first one is in the area of health. There's a project called the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative, ADNI. If you look it up on Google. And it's a really interesting public-private partnership where NIH and the private sector and a number of foundations got together to create a data collection for the Alzheimer's community. Now they're adding gene sequencing data, so now it's going to grow precipitously because of all of that. And it really is a community resource for looking at Alzheimer's and doing research around Alzheimer's disease treatment. They're looking for biomarkers for Alzheimer's. That's something that helps them understand the disease a lot better. This is a really extraordinary public-private partnership. It's brought in, I don't know, roughly $120+ million to really kind of create that. And it's really making a difference in terms of Alzheimer's. So here you have a public-private partnership. It's changed the culture around health and for this particular group, et cetera. Another place where you see public-private partnership with a different business model is if you look at social science research, something like the panel study of income dynamics. This is something where the Institute for Social Research at the University of Michigan, so you get some institutional funding, ICPSR, I guess the Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research is there. They have subscribers. And this data collection has been very, very important for social sciences. A third example is when I lived in San Diego, and we had the natural disaster du jour there, which was tremendous fires. And, we all kind of figured out, do we have to evacuate? Should we move from our house? Based on basically a partnership between Google, who provided maps to us through the internet, and the local government, who was saying, here are the evacuation spaces, here's what we need people to do, how do we get the message out? And I'm not sure what the business model, but I'm sure it was in real time. I think all of these things are really interesting ways that people are starting to kind of lower the boundaries between these traditional sectors to share data. But all of them require some business model, and I think those business models will really vary.
Mm-hmm.
Right here.
So a phrase that I keep hearing is who's going to pay for it? And running with the example of healthcare data, it's pretty well understood that preventative and preemptive medicine is far cheaper for individuals, for hospital networks, and in terms of the health benefits, it's beneficial over reactionary medicine. So I guess how do you switch the paradigm of the conversation from cost to who's going to save, and how do we move toward more of a Pareto optimal solution of having open data, maybe hosted by the government or by private companies, and realizing that and actualizing these cost savings and public good benefits to all people?
Well, I mean, if you look at it and ask yourself, maybe it's not really for me to determine who pays for it. I think that's a very complex question across multiple different responsibilities. But from a very simplistic standpoint, typically, as we see in our industry, the people who pay for it are the people who are benefiting from it. And if you think about government, government is an enormous reimburser of healthcare and healthcare costs, and as an entity would be the number one beneficiary of a healthier society, because they would be able to it would cost less in order to reimburse or support. It's not to suggest to you that the government should bear the entire cost. It's just they would be a clear beneficiary of data and information being moved out to physicians that are providing health services on behalf of individuals who are being reimbursed by the government. And that's just a practical fact. Insurance companies, look, we work directly with insurance companies, and I can tell you the interesting dynamic. We have insurance companies that work directly with us that use analytics and predictive analytics to provide proactive advice to their clients in order to reduce the healthcare costs for their own private insurance plans. Okay, this is happening all the time. Question is, why is it not happening in a more global basis for which the government would be a beneficiary? But believe me, the insurance companies, the HMOs, the healthcare providers themselves, they are constantly employing analytics in their own subset of the market and providing preventative information back to their clients. The challenge is the people who are receiving that have to be in that particular segment of that industry, they have to be in that segment of that insurance company, and it's not a benefit that's being made available across the economy, nor across those private doctors who are being reimbursed directly by the government. So I would suggest that this is a well understood beneficial equation that already exists and is being employed in the private industry, private reimbursement side, and I think the government would be able to benefit itself by fostering some of the same foundational thinking, I think, in their delivery or reimbursement of healthcare.
Yeah.
Another question over here, right here.
I'm Deborah Decker with the Stinson Center. Perhaps I'm showing my age, but when I was at Wharton Business School more than 30 years ago, I took the first strategic planning class, and that was a new discipline. I'm wondering if there's a discipline missing now that could develop the link between data and knowledge to inform decisions. I mean, I do consulting, and this is mentioned I do research. I've talked at hackathons. There seems to be a big gap between the techies and the decision makers. And there's nobody trained in the middle to translate, to do the functional requirements. And so, could you talk a little bit about maybe the development of this new discipline and how maybe NYU or some business schools or others, or policy schools?
We've been looking at that a bit at the GovLab at NYU, and a first thought is really a very simple one, which is to change the model of a hackathon to something that we called an ideathon, and I'm sure there's a better word for it. All suggestions welcome. But we actually did a small experiment recently where we did a hackathon around both New York and Newark data, but we brought in not only coders but also policy people working in Mayor Booker's office, working for the city of New York, and we looked at a couple of issues like price gouging around food and the safety of buses, things like that. But the whole point was to say, let's get these people in the same room at the same time, so that we can really facilitate some way of working this that addresses the policy issues with the technical tools, rather than having tech people guess what the policy solution might be, or the policy people say, gee, it'd be great if somebody could figure out how to code this. And it was, I would say for a first effort, it was pretty successful. I mean, that's one small step, but I would think that that's easily replicable, and starting to shift to a different kind of idea of what a hackathon could be for these public problems. Be great to see a lot of people try that, and there may be an emergent discipline, or there may simply be a new way of working on these kinds of issues.
I think part of what you're asking is, as well, is that we're really good at moving forward on the technical infrastructure around data. We're hacking, we're analyzing, we're making great sense of this data. There's when we move to data, from data to information and information to knowledge, and we imbue it with meaning, purpose, context, I think there's a lot of things on the horizon that we're going to have to deal with. Number one, how do I know that, now my data has a home, someone's paying the mortgage. How do I know what data is a good neighbor? What I want to know is what data is legitimate. When I see my data, does it make sense? Is it legitimate? Is it relatively error-free? Does it have a context? So all of these things about sort of quality of data and quality of information, I think are important. I think we're going to increasingly have these issues. Nick talked a little bit about interoperability of different data sets that you use together to really synthesize really fantastic information. How do we know which data sets are compatible? If I have one data set and it's measuring things in centimeters, and I have another data set and it's measuring relevant things in inches, and that's just a metadata compatibility. But how do I know which data sets can be really used together in a fruitful way? And then I think finally, there'll be a lot of data sets out there and a lot of different rules applying to each data set. Where does governance come from, in the data world? And so if you think about it, it's not just technical infrastructure, it's a social infrastructure that we have to put on the data world. And I think we're just starting to grapple with, what that even might be. And I think your question is a really important one, because this is a great resource for us, but it's only a great resource if we can use it productively.
I just quickly would say, I think to your specific point about the gulf that had existed maybe in previous generations between techies and business people, I would suggest that gulf has narrowed dramatically over the last 15 years or so, and most pronouncedly in the last 5 years or so. I recently spoke at an MBA class for a local university, and I found out at the MBA class they're actually teaching business intelligence as part of an MBA undergraduate, as part of the coursework that you have to graduate, which means that they're basically telling people that are going off to be managers and directors in businesses that you must understand the access of information as a core competency now to run a business. I think what I've seen is this gap has closed. In fact, frankly, it's even gone so far as to tell you that the really well-run companies, if you really look at the people running them, either they or the people directly below them are extremely focused on data and data information and data insight, and you see a lot of managerial positions popping up in companies now. Chief Analytics Officer, Chief Data Officer. These are new jobs, new roles, because of the prominence of that growing over time. So I think what you're going to see is more executive positions moving up to help bridge that gap between the tech people and the business people, and what you're going to continue to see, I think, is a recognition that in organizations, to be good at your job, you have to understand data and information as a core competency.
Thank you. Join me in a round of applause. We're out of, but what a great panel. Thanks, folks.